Hi, this is John Romano. I'm recording this lecture for World Civilization to 1500, History 1100. And in this lecture I'm going to be speaking about the empires of Persia. You may well never have heard about the Persian Empire, and perhaps in comparison with many of the other empires we have discussed and will discuss, it has really suffered at the hands of modern people. We don't tend to discuss it that often, but this has nothing to do with its importance for the ancient world. What the Persian Empire was a series of empires issuing out of modern-day Iran. And what I'm showing you here in this first image is the enormous realm under the power of the Persians at the height of their power. It was an enormous area that was much larger than anything that the ancient Near East had known alone. The size, in some ways, was something that was really amazing, an amazing accomplishment of conquest. And altogether, the empire would equal around 1,800 miles within it. And it would include nearly every kind of topography possible: mountains, valleys, jungles, deserts, and farmable land. Perhaps the most farmable land is an area we've discussed in this class before, and that is Mesopotamia, which, as you can see, was just one of the many conquests of the Persian Empire. Another, of course, was Egypt. The population of the Persian Empire at its height was 35 million people, which in the ancient world is quite impressive. We will see, however, that having an empire of this size does create certain new problems. The empire was a mixture of different languages and ethnicities, and it never really unified all of these different peoples very successfully. We also think that administration was something that was a challenge. And to some degree, it was a challenge that they drew upon by using lessons learned from some of the great empires of the ancient Near East that we've seen already in this class. To some degree, though, we think the Persian Empire had to dedicate even more resources to things like, for instance, roads. They needed very good highways to improve communications and control the regions that they had conquered, not all of whom really wanted to be a part of the Persian Empire. They also had to find a way to feed all of these people. And as impressive as their agricultural production was, it did require, in essence, that they constantly had to find ways to feed people in some of the areas that were not as agriculturally plentiful, including some of the core lands of the empire in modern-day Iran. When all of this was in operation during the empire, this entire area became an enormous crossroads for trade, and in fact a cultural bridge. And through its conquest, what we see is that all sorts of new peoples were put back to back. And in some cases, this is because people migrated to the region. For the most part, though, it was conquest by the emperors of Persia that formed this new empire. And you'll see here this image from one of the palaces of the Persians. These are meant to evoke peoples from all different parts of the empire with slightly different dress. The one thing that unifies these people is that all of them, no matter who they are, their national dress, they have to bring offerings to the emperor to show that they're subjugated to his might, that they owe him. When we speak about the Persian Empire, the easiest way to break down its long history is by speaking about four major dynasties, four major ruling houses that we'll see. And there is some overlap in the way they ruled, but there are definitely some distinctive features that we have to distinguish among the four. The first of the ruling houses of the Persian Empire is a family known as the Achaemenids, sometimes referred to as the Achaemenid dynasty. The person who launched this family, and in fact launched the entire imperial venture to create this new empire, is the man pictured here, the man known as King Cyrus. And this is a very fanciful image, of course, of King Cyrus. Initially, Cyrus really seemed to be an unlikely candidate to end up becoming a great world emperor. He had come from a small mountainous region in modern-day southwestern Iran. Most people who grew up where he grew up would go on to become shepherds, not great conquerors. Slowly, Cyrus became known as a very tough local ruler. He began to gather people to his side. They admired just what a great military mind he had. He was a strategist, even before he actually started conquering anything of worth. We think that Cyrus was smart enough to rule from the area he had grown up in, the area of the mountains, and he created this terrific mountain fortress, which was impregnable. No one from the outside could get in. Slowly, tribes began to be conquered by Cyrus's men, and we think in time he ends up becoming the overlord of virtually all of modern-day Iran. Then he began to create a slightly more impressive army under his control. And this is an image that we have of some of the warriors of the Achaemenid dynasty who were known as the Immortals. They, of course, could die like anyone, but the reason they were called Immortals is that when one of these men died on the battlefield, there was always someone waiting to take his place. So in that way, they were immortal. The army always remained at the same size. This army, now ruled by Cyrus, began to strike out in all different directions. They struck at what today is modern-day Turkey, Mesopotamia, later Egypt. In the course of 20 years, Cyrus would go from being a minor regional ruler to a king, an emperor, in fact, of an enormous territory. Well, we do not have a huge amount left specifically for the reign of Cyrus. One thing that you can see today is the tomb where Cyrus was initially buried, which is pictured here. Unfortunately, Cyrus's body is no longer in this tomb. We don't know where it is now, and all of the things that were buried with him are also gone. Tomb robbers must have taken them centuries ago. Even after Cyrus's death, the empire he had forged by blood would survive and, in fact, expand. We're not going to go through all the successors of Cyrus here, but I do want to point out probably his greatest successor in the Achaemenid dynasty, and that is the man pictured here on the great throne. This is the King Darius I. One of the wonderful sources we have for Darius is this enormous inscription. You may not be able to tell it because it's not very clear, but underneath this image, this is actually an inscription in Persian. Darius, it is obvious, was known for being a great warrior, just as Cyrus was. And you can see here, this is Darius. Two of his men are behind him, and In front of Darius are all of the different peoples who have been conquered by him. When first you look at this, you may think this is impressive, and in fact, Darius must have managed to conquer just as much as Cyrus had. When you begin to look at the inscription a little more carefully, what you begin to see is that, in fact, Darius, in many cases, was not conquering things for the first time, but reconquering them. The territories of the Persian Empire had a habit of often breaking off from central authority, which meant that the emperor had to go around with the army and, in fact, reconquer regions that, at least on paper, were already supposed to be part of the Persian Empire. You notice, too, by the way, just looking at this image, the grand scale that the Persians did propaganda. This is carved into a mountainside, this inscription. In addition to the kinds of things that Darius was doing on the battlefield, we also think he centralizes the government with the capital city shown right here in the map, Persepolis, the great capital city from which the empire was ruled. At its height, we think Persepolis had vast halls, the residence of the emperor, the treasury, and all of the most important administrators who would surround the emperor. Persepolis really was almost completely destroyed by your friend Alexander the Great. But you can still see today, I'll show you some of the image of the remains of the palace, some of which have been, in modern days, for the purpose of tourism, reconstructed. Some of this, by the way, you can tell the regions where the full series of buildings once stood. Now there's very little left. These are some of the gates of the great palace. And again, you can see some of these magnificent sort of bulls at the top of columns. We think that Darius begins not only to introduce the idea of having a strong, centralized administration, but he also begins to really trumpet himself in all of his documentation and inscriptions, calling himself the King of Kings, which meant, in essence, the greatest king ever. In addition to having the emperor at the top, we also see this series of different administrators who served him well. The most important of these people were satraps. And in fact, this is just the Persian name for a governor. And the governors, the satraps, were sent out to different parts of the empire, and they were meant to represent the interests of the emperor no matter where they went. The satraps were always Persian. They came from the core territories of the Persian Empire. And in addition, we think the satraps would often take people on the local level to help them with their job. The Persian emperors were somewhat paranoid when it came to sharing power, and we do not think they ever really fully trust the satraps, even though they're invested with so much authority. For that reason, they would always try to keep military generals with armies close to areas where satraps were, should any of the satraps get the idea that they were going to try to take over territory. In addition, they would send out imperial spies from the emperors to the satraps to very carefully watch over them. The Persian Empire, though, really needed this huge constellation of different professionals to make it run. Some people, for instance, collected taxes for the emperor. Others kept records. Some were translators, and this was an important job. When you have an empire that brings together so many different ethnicities, you need people who can speak and translate. They have to translate the different languages. Persians began to introduce regular taxes and standard laws that held together their empire. They began to build strong roads, and they created a postal service to bring messages. They began to mobilize people to undertake huge public work projects, for instance, like building canals. Some Persians were expert in using different kinds of metals and in creating new things, iron tools, and some of our more spectacular examples that we have preserved are working in gold. Here's a gold coin, for instance. Here is a gold drinking cup, clearly designed for the emperor, someone at the very height of the empire. And here's another example of a bracelet. Eventually, we think that the Achaemenid dynasty begins to run into some very serious difficulties. This relationship between the emperors and the subject people. Early in the Persian Empire, in the Achaemenid dynasty, we think that Cyrus was someone who actually pursued a policy of toleration when it came to religious and cultural difference. And here is the famous Cyrus cylinder, which is this kind of football-shaped inscription by Cyrus that allowed different peoples within this empire to keep their own religious traditions, to keep their own cultural traditions. And some people have said that this was not so much a deep-seated love of tolerance as it was a policy dictated by practicality. When you have so many people coming together, it only makes sense to allow them to pursue the culture as they chose, so long as they respected the political authority of the Achaemenid dynasty. We know that, in fact, that Cyrus himself really, because of this policy, was praised by many in the empire. And this includes, in fact, the Jewish population that lived within the empire. And we know that Cyrus, in fact, allowed Jews to return to Jerusalem and to rebuild the temple, for which he is actually praised in the Hebrew Bible. For reasons that are not entirely clear, later emperors began to shift in this policy of toleration. It is possible that they felt that some of the problems with rebellions in the empire, people not respecting the authority of the emperor, had to do with difference. And this actually, this change in policy would backfire badly on the Achaemenid dynasty. And rather than unifying people by forcing them to follow Persian religion and culture, instead it inflamed their passion all the more and made them more likely to rebel. Another of the problems the Achaemenid dynasty ran into is something we've already discussed in this class, and that was the failed attempt to invade and to conquer the Greek city-states, the Persian Wars, as we referred to them earlier. This appeared to be a logical thing for the Persians to do, the next step in building their world empire. But as you'll remember, although the Greek city-states did not have the kind of military resources, either in men or material, the Greeks really were much cleverer about how they fought this battle. And in fact, the great numbers of the Persians did not manage to overwhelm the Greeks as they had initially hoped. before Alexander the Great, the Greeks did not initially really have the capacity to destroy the entire Persian Empire. But the Greek wars, although they didn't destroy the Achaemenid dynasty at first, they were an enormous waste of money and lives. And it really, when they saw that the great Persians could be defeated by a much smaller power, this gave hope for some of these small, subjugated areas of the Persian Empire that they too could rebel and be independent of the Persians. So, in effect, what ends up happening is that those rebellions that had always existed, even under Darius, as we had seen, began to really seriously challenge the ability of the Achaemenids to rule. As we had discussed earlier, although the Persians were already weak, what really ends up completely destroying the old Achaemenid dynasty and bringing in a new dynasty known as the Seleucid dynasty was Alexander the Great. Alexander's small but well-disciplined army really began to cut through the Persian Empire and win victory after victory. As we've discussed earlier, of course, Alexander ended up confiscating a good deal of the imperial wealth that he came upon, and ended up also setting fire to the city of Persepolis. Alexander, while he was still alive, tried to portray himself as the legitimate successor of the old emperors. It is difficult to say how Alexander would actually have ruled as a Persian emperor, in part because, as we've seen, he did not live long enough to really hold it for very long. We do see that it appears that Alexander's plan, and this is something that will be carried on by the Seleucid dynasty, was largely to keep in place much of the administrative structure that the old dynasty, the Achaemenid dynasty, had once created. So, for instance, satraps continued to exist. The general who ended up taking over the Persian Empire after Alexander's death is pictured in this coin here. His name is Seleucus, and he gives name to the second dynasty, the Seleucid dynasty. Seleucus, also pictured here, had been one of the elite generals who had fought bravely by Alexander's side. Upon Alexander's death, though, as we've seen, all of his generals tried their best to rip away some part of Alexander's empire, and Seleucus was the winner when it came to the Persian Empire. Seleucus did not have all that many new ideas at first upon becoming an emperor, and many of the people living in the Persian Empire must have thought that essentially we were talking about a different name of the emperor, but the same ways of ruling. The same taxes were collected, the same roads, the same satraps, the same governors. If Seleucus had a new idea, and he did have at least one, it was to try his best to bring in Greeks, and to have Greeks come and to bring some of their ideas with them. Seleucus felt that one of the real things that was lacking in the Persian Empire was the kind of Greek cities that he had known. And he had hoped that these Greek cities would stimulate trade, and they would stimulate economic development. So they began to actively call out for Greeks to migrate. And you'll see some of the later rulers of the Seleucid dynasty have these coins that have Greek inscriptions on them. The Seleucid dynasty, though, never really has a very strong hold on the Persian Empire. The reason for this, you might say, was somewhat predictable. These new emperors were viewed as foreigners, and in fact that was not an incorrect view. They were foreigners. These were people who had come from Macedon, not from any of the regions within the Persian Empire. What this meant was the number of rebellions, which had always been a difficulty even in the old dynasty, these rebellions began to become more and more frequent. Some of the rebellions became so serious that the satraps, the governors, were the people who were either joining in or actually leading some of these rebellions because they felt that these emperors had lost control. The end result of this is the Seleucid dynasty ends up becoming extremely weak, and it just continuously hemorrhages land, just losing land left and right. What finally ends in kicking in the sort of rotten door of the Seleucid dynasty is the third dynasty of the Persian Empire, known as the Parthians, or the Parthian dynasty. The Parthians initially were a semi-nomadic group who were known from traveling from one territory to the next on their horses. This new group, the Parthians, initially based this new empire in Iran, and then, as we've seen previously, they began to extend their power both to the west and to the east. The reason that the Parthians were able first to topple the Seleucids and then to form a strong government is that they were a very strong, skillful group of warriors. We think that they had learned much of their abilities in fighting against other nomadic groups, and as you can see from this one statue, they were known for their horse riding abilities and the ability to both ride on a horse at the same time and shoot arrows, which is no small feat. Here's another image of one Parthian leader riding on his horse. What is very interesting to us about the Parthians is they did not seem to have the same level of respect for centralized government as the Persians had been accustomed to up until this point. And just like many nomadic groups tend to do, even after having conquered all of this territory, the leaders of the Parthians would get together as a federation of leaders every so often. They would meet together in councils. Then they would determine what their policy would be. In some ways, we think that the Parthians, when they conquered this territory, they really had no desire to get their hands dirty with the business of governing. And really, in many ways, they continued training just as they had previously, to ride their horses, to attack others. Some people think that, if anything, the Parthians actually end up becoming slightly slightly better warriors, we might say. The reason for this is that they end up having much better resources to feed their horses. If, for instance, they began to feed their horses alfalfa during the winter. Previously, their horses had really fed very poorly during the winter, so that meant that they had to feed them when the spring finally came back. When you have an entire empire, though, to feed your horses, then of course they tend to stay much stronger. And these larger animals, these larger horses, could really support people on them, including people in armor. And the Persians tend to begin to actually wear armor more often. Now, the Parthians, as I told you, because they had no desire to really bother with the business of government, what they begin to do is just pick up everything that the old empires, the old dynasties had done. For instance, they have satraps again. They use the exact same techniques of administration and taxation. All of these things would have been very similar. And in fact, they farmed out much of that. They have some of their subjects do governing while they did battle for the most part. We also think that this new dynasty got the idea from the previous dynasties to have a capital city. This is a slightly new capital city, which is, you can see right here, Ctesiphon. You don't hear the C when you pronounce it. This is the new capital city of the Parthians. We do not have much of this capital city left. This is one of the great gates of Ctesiphon, which, as you can see, is still standing today, and is a major tourist attraction in Iraq. We think that the great weakness of the Parthians was not it had nothing to do with their ability to fight. No one really denied that they really could manage to defeat their enemies on the battlefield. This kind of inability, though, to unite around a single leader meant that there was no single policy that they followed. And sometimes their government policy was simply incoherent, or different leaders wanted to do different things. What this meant was some of the subject peoples again begin to rebel whenever they get the sense that they have an advantage to doing so. So that meant that they never had a very firm control over the territory. On top of this, we think that the Parthians were involved in constant wars with their neighbor to the west, the Roman Empire. And at least 3 times, Romans actually captured Ctesiphon, their capital city. Finally, we think rebellions begin to completely take down any vestige of government and really just completely end up destroying the Parthians dynasty. Just to give you some idea, though, before I move on, that although the Parthians started as nomads, they began to like some of the same sort of shiny things as previous Persians. These are some of the finds that we have from some of the burials of Parthians, which showed again they really did love their jewelry as well. This is a head from a Parthian dwelling. The fourth and the final of the dynasties of the Persian Empire that we'll be discussing is known as the Sassanid dynasty. And this is just one of their rulers, or their emperors. This new dynasty came also from Iran, and in fact, they claimed in their propaganda that they were a revival of the first dynasty, the Achaemenid dynasty. The first step that this new dynasty had to go through, which we've seen before, they had to topple the old dynasty, so they had to first defeat the Parthians in battle, which was relatively easy because of their lack of unity. The big goal of the Sassanids immediately, upon beginning to take this new territory to rebuild the empire, was to try to recreate the splendor of early Persia. And we can tell this in the sort of finery that we have depicting some of the Persian emperors in this dynasty, in the Sassanid dynasty. Here's one example. Here is one of the emperors of the Sassanid dynasty hunting, which was long one of the favorite things of emperors to do. Feasting, of course. Here's again a horse that they created. And here is a Again, a very elaborate jug. The Sassanids rebuilt the capital city at Ctesiphon. They proclaimed themselves, as we had seen previously, as the King of Kings. And in many ways, they revive the exact same system of administration that we've seen previously. If there was a slightly new idea here in the Sassanid dynasty, we think that they were real believers, that one of the things emperors had to do was found new cities, and they certainly do this. And they also try to invite merchants, both their merchants and other merchants, to trade. And we do see there are actually some fruits to this policy. For instance, some new crops like rice, sugarcane, certain citrus fruits, eggplant, and cotton. All of these things are introduced to the Persian Empire for the first time. If I were to point to one emperor during the Sassanid dynasty who is particularly renowned, it is this man pictured on the right here, Shapur I. And you can get some idea from this carving, also a carving on the mountain, what Shapur I was known for. And that is his skills as a warrior, and in particular fighting against the foe to the west, the Roman Empire. And you notice that in this particular image, two Roman emperors are shown as people who are handling his horse and bowing down before him. The point is Shapur I wants to humiliate the Romans. Shapur I would end up defeating several Roman armies, and he settled some of these prisoners in his realm. The most famous of these, he actually once captured a Roman emperor in battle, alive, which was an amazing feat at the time. And this is a small sort of commemorative brooch that was made. This is made of onyx. And you can see on the right, that is Shapur I, physically taking the Roman emperor with his hand. This was not just a matter of pride for the Sassanid dynasty, though. We think that part of the reason why Shapur wanted to bring some Romans into his empire was because he wanted to learn from them. And we actually know that certain Roman engineers were brought in to help him construct new roads and to construct dams, because Romans were known for their engineering capacities. And this is a helmet during the Sassanid dynasty. After Shapur I's death, we think that the kind of expansion that the Persians were known for, and that they really depended upon to pump new money into their economy, well, this kind of expansion really sputters out. In the West, Shapur could certainly defeat the Romans, and his successors did as well, but they could never really seriously dent into their territory all that much. In the East, the Persians also, they meet the Indians, and never can really advance very far against them. What that meant is that on both borders, the Sassanid dynasty begins engaging in this lengthy series of border disputes that ends up really sapping their energy, but doesn't actually give them all that much in return. This process really seriously weakens the Sassanid dynasty. And in fact, they become so weak that when a new faith, Islam, is founded, that they are really one of the first victims of this new Muslim expansion. And in fact, that expansion that we'll discuss later will bring a complete end to the Persian Empire. One thing that I have completely neglected to discuss, but really is something that is very important for the Persian Empire, is the question of religion. And the major religion of the Persian Empire is a religion known as Zoroastrianism. And you may never have heard of Zoroastrian as a religion, but most people tend to think that it was a religion that was very influential in the religions of Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. For instance, its belief in angels is something that all of these later religions would hold. The founder of this new religion was a person known as Zoroaster, who's pictured here in a much later Renaissance image. And the reason I'm putting this up is we have absolutely no idea what Zoroaster really looked like. And we really think, again, much of Zoroaster's life is completely mysterious to us today. We do not have any doubt that Zoroaster was a real person. And we have all sorts of colorful stories told about him, but in fact, most of these are much later. You may see that if you look on the outline for this lecture, that we really don't even know his exact birth and death dates. From what we can piece together based upon the few sources we do have, we tend to think that Zoroaster came from an aristocratic family. He seems at some point to have been a priest of one of the ancestral religions of Persia, but for whatever reason he became disenchanted with this religion. His response was, at around 20 years of age, to go out wandering in search of wisdom. Supposedly, after having traveled for around 10 years, he ends up having this series of famous visions. And these visions convinced him that, in fact, he did not know the true God until this point. At this point, he receives this vision of the God, the supreme God of this new religion, a God known as Ahura Mazda, a name that means the wise Lord. And he's pictured here on the left. Ahura Mazda supposedly spoke to him and said that Ahura Mazda had chosen him, Zoroaster, as a prophet, and like any prophet, Zoroaster had to spread his message. It will not please you to learn that we do not know exactly what the message of Ahura Mazda was. And this has to do with a very serious source problem with early Zoroastrianism. The doctrine of this faith was only transmitted orally by priests of this religion, and it took a long time to finally commit most of their doctrines to writing. In fact, many of their greatest theological works are in hymns that they would sing, but very often not write down. The people responsible for this learning are the priests of the Zoroastrian religion known as magi. And again, you'll note that these, of course, are the same magi who appear in the gospel. And again, the message of the gospel is, of course, that everyone began to recognize Jesus, even the people, these priests who had come from the east. One of the other great problems that we run into with sources for Zoroastrians is that in many cases we think that later Muslims who did not recognize this as a real religion would destroy some of their texts. From what we can piece together, it appears that Zoroastrians would recognize Ahura Mazda, who again came in this revelation to Zoroaster, as the supreme god. But there were also lesser gods. Ahura Mazda, they felt, was engaged in this long cosmic conflict with this kind of evil spirit who worked against good. After a long struggle, it was believed that Ahura Mazda would win. Good would ultimately prevail. Evil would disappear forever. At this point, human souls would undergo a period of judgment, and according to your deeds, your thoughts, you would be either rewarded or punished. Moral people would go to paradise. Evil ones would go to a hell. With all this being said, we do not think Ahura Mazda wanted his followers to renounce the world. In fact, he was seen as a good god. He wanted people to enjoy the fruits of the world properly. This religion, Zoroastrianism, became remarkably popular throughout Persia. And really, this was the dominant religion of the empire. The Magi, these priests, became the people who would preserve the religion, its rituals, its morals, its oral tales, its hymns. And we also think that Persian emperors would really associate themselves very deeply with this religion, with both the Magi and generally with the teachings of Zoroastrianism. This is why in many of our inscriptions you will see Ahura Mazda. In this case, he's giving a fist pump. This is Ahura Mazda giving a fist pump to an emperor. And you will also see floating above here this inscription we previously saw with Darius I. This is meant to be Ahura Mazda who is blessing the emperor Darius here. This is, of course, because Ahura Mazda was the one they believed who sanctioned the rule of emperors. He's what gave them the ability to rule. And this is why we think, too, that the Magi have a political voice in the empire as well. Sometimes the emperors will turn to them for guidance as well. That is the lecture on the empires of Persia. And thank you for listening, and I will see you soon.